All right, in our second video on family and family issues, we're going to be looking at a couple of problems that occur in family units in our society. And in the next video, we'll look at issues particularly pertaining to families of color, Black and Latino families. One of the most interesting findings of Stephanie Kuntz's work, a historian, is that no matter what period in society we live in, there always seems to be public concern around the family. When we think about the social construction of social problems, one of the questions that continually rises is, why are people always so freaked out about what's happening to the family? Part of it is what the institution around raising children and caring for one another performs in our society. Right? We're concerned about what happens to our kids, but we're also concerned about what happens to wives and children. One of the more disturbing things we found during the coronavirus pandemic is that there's been an estimated pretty strong increase in domestic violence, that is, violence against a domestic partner. Why am I showing you that, telling you that with this slide? Well, it's important to remember, we talked about rights in the last video, and it's important to remember that before 1970 or really in the early 90s, the rights of a husband over his wife were very much in line with patriarchal institutions, that is, male-dominated institutions. And in particular, essentially the wife was the property of the husband. Over time, as women's rights movements gained strength, that control lessened. However, in 1960, for example, if a man raped his wife, it wasn't rape. There was no law against it. So one of the issues we see is that domestic partnerships, marriages, can be sources of violence and control. And why is that? Part of these have to do with those male-dominated attitudes. It's almost all domestic violence is committed by men against women. Many murders in our country, in fact, most murders are committed by someone who is known to the victim. This is true of sexual abuse as well. So families can be a place of hidden violence, in part because as a society, we tend to say every family has their own business. We tend to be slow to react to signs of violence. Part of what we see with the pandemic is that without teachers seeing their students every day, and without people seeing their coworkers every day, the sort of hidden realm of the home becomes a bit more obscure, and a place where being in the same physical place, being stuck together, creates opportunities for abuse and violence. And so this is true both between parents and children and between domestic partners, people who live together and supposedly love each other. Other key issues. Often when I ask students what's one of the biggest issues around parenting and pregnancy today, they talk about too many teenagers having babies. And this was a big panic when I was a kid in the 90s. Sometimes it's a panic today. But actually what we see is that the number of the average age of mothers at birth is actually increasing, not decreasing. We might note people think this is a problem, particularly with Latinx and Black communities, but as we see from this Pew research, actually the average age of Black mothers has increased from 22 to 24 years old. Though we do notice some particular differences. Non-Hispanic whites, it's a good 3-year difference. And for Asian Pacific Islander families, it's 30. We might ask, why this ethnic difference between the ages at birth? This comes up again when we look globally. Annual births for per 1,000 teenage women um, are actually pretty low in most of Western Europe, Canada, but are much higher in the African continent. Um, it's pretty low in China. Partly that has to do because China tightly controls its birth rate. But why are these higher rates in South America and the African continent? What could explain this? Um, Part of what we see here again is that patriarchy. Um, uh, Cultures in South America and Africa, and this is a very, very broad generalization, but tend to be more patriarchal. And part of what we see in many patriarchal societies and cultures is desire to control women. This is true of, for example, many Islamic institutions, but also of Christian fundamentalist institutions. So a lot of religious fundamentalism, whether it's Islam or Christianity, tends to be centered around patriarchal domination. So if any of you remember Roy Moore in Alabama, he was running for, I believe, Senate there. And one of the knocks against him was that he was a bit of a creepy pedophilia kind of guy. He would hang out outside the mall and like wait for teen girls, and dated a teenage girl when he was in his 30s. While that's creepy, part of what this reflects is actually his fundamentalism as an evangelical Christian, because those religions support essentially getting girls early, marrying them off when they're still very malleable and controllable. And so this is a commonality from that we find in rural counties in the U.S. and in some countries on the African continent and South America. They're more male-dominated, and part of this means marrying and controlling women at an early age. So culture and religion ties in a lot to this. Lastly, we can think about the household division of labor. So this is where we might do a survey that's called a time use, where you fill out your daily, you have a very rigid, essentially a survey you get that accounts for every 10 minutes of your day for the whole day. And despite increasing positivity around fathers being in the household and not working, we see that the average amount of time actually spent doing daily chores is still disproportionately laid at the feet of women. Women, this is famously called the second shift, do much more cleaning, food prep, household management, while men certainly do more lawn and garden and house repairs, but the overall time is pretty distinct here. So while we may have achieved some greater parity, this means that all those working mothers we talked about, remember 50% of households have two income earners, all those mothers are still doing their second shift at home. What's interesting about this Pew Research on the right, if you look closely, what's interesting is that the dark green line shows the perception that the mother does more. The blue in the middle is that the father does more. And what's interesting is that fathers tend to think that women do less. So if we look at that first line, it says fathers 47. That means that 47% of fathers think the mother does more, but 45% think they share equally, while only 32% of mothers think they share equally. And this trend is true across all of them, especially if we look at household chores and responsibilities. 64% of fathers think they share equally, while only 53% of women. So what this tells us is that men's perception of their own work in the household is different from mothers. And what does that tell us, perhaps, about men?